Sounds good.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. This is Bob O'Brien. I'll be the moderator for this session. Welcome to the breakout session 1, Future-Proofing Cloud Security Post-Pandemic. Just a couple of reminders. This session is being recorded. Everybody is on mute. If you have any questions, please enter them in chat and we'll take your questions at the end of the session. Our presenter today is Nathan Smolenski. Nathan currently serves as head of enterprise security strategy as part of the global strategy team at Netskope, focused on the digital transformation of cybersecurity programs, security research initiatives, and the evolution of security technology and architectures. Prior to joining Netskope, Nathan served as head of cybersecurity strategy and engineering for the New York Life Insurance Company, as well as in previous leadership roles as Chief Information Security Officer of Spencer Stuart, Zurich North American, and 21st Century Insurance. Please welcome Nathan.
Thank you, Bob. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. As Bob mentioned, we're going to be talking through this talk track is around future-proofing cloud security post-pandemic. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the drivers and some of the challenges that many of you probably have recognized as a result of the pandemic and just everything that's going on today. And ultimately, we'll talk a little bit about, really the things that we need to consider as we start to reposition our security controls and our approaches to really gain better insights, better visibility, and get better outcomes. So why don't we get started? So first, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen since the pandemic. And really, I think many businesses have been well prepared for this and many have not, but we'll talk through this, what we're calling a forced digital transformation, right? So one of the things that we've seen a tremendous amount of is really, there's been a need to, really, because everyone's working remotely, move to, sort of a new way of working, right? Focusing on collaboration and really adopting cloud in many cases, cloud services, SaaS services, collaboration platforms, et cetera, adopting them because there was a need to. There was a need to reconnect our employees that were no longer in that physical workplace that we're used to. And so we've been challenged by that. And in many cases, it's been because we had to just go and adopt these technologies, in a very urgent manner to return to operations. And so the challenge there is that often that our controls that we have, that we've relied on for many years, they weren't adapted for remote work. Ultimately, in many cases, physical premise. And so, we ran into challenges like VPN capacity issues and having issues with users needing to go direct to some of the cloud services and other service providers that were really important to our environments. And really, that's put a strain on, security teams and audit teams and risk management teams, because a lot of the visibility that we used to gain now was really kind of absent. If we weren't pushing, everything back through the data center, like many oftentimes we did, the traditional equipment and monitoring of user activities really became impossible to do, or much more difficult, right? And so as we adopted more services to get this return to work, we often, really had to really think about how our business was actually going to manage all of this remotely, right? Where's our customer data? Do we have a regulatory impact now because we might have customer service people at home, in a basement or in an office at home, and really not having the same control considerations that we've really been thinking about the last few months. And obviously, there are ways to solve these problems, but we want to set the stage on what those problems are. And we have to really focus on remote working now, right? So there's a number of things that are different about that besides the location that we might be in. There's pitfalls around collaboration, right? So our threat landscape changed a little bit when we had to adopt and often, rapidly adopt a variety of different kinds of services, right? So we're taking on collaboration tools where we can exchange data, collaboration tools where we can actually work together, all kinds of different functionality and technologies being brought into the workplace, oftentimes under a real urgent need. And that's provided a really big challenge for us around data governance, right? So we say data governance gone wild, but if you think about this, every kind of record that we used to interact with, within the office and within applications that might be positioned in our data center or service provider environments, we've now had to kind of move a lot, right or wrong, we've had to move a lot of those things to return to operation, to ensure that we're able to get, actually the things that we need, right, and have the right control environment operating. So that's something that we have to address. We also have to address the compliance gaps, right? So we talk about the view of compliance, right? So these controls that we have designed over the years, now we potentially have gaps because we're maybe going direct to the internet and we're not bringing traffic back to a data center where we can see it anymore, right? And again, that has been brought on by this need to maintain operations at all costs, right? We needed to actually allow activities that used to be prohibited unless we had a VPN turned on, right? And so those kinds of things have challenged us a little bit, and really that's where the control gaps are starting to arise. And then we have the thoughts of regulated data impact, right? So we talked about data governance gone wild, but right? So you may have additional data sovereignty risk or legal and compliance issues if you aren't really understanding and clear on where exactly each of these things are, or where's your data going? How can we see that, and how can we actually get our arms around that as we go forward? And so as we look to this, like when we think about returning to work, which many of us have done, many of us never really came out of work, but there's a large portion of folks that are going to be returning to work. There's a lot of different things we have to think about now, right? We may not be able to have our traditional assurance providers and auditors being able to be out in the field actually doing the things that they are supposed to be doing to monitor, control efficacy and the validity of the controls that we have. How we've been working has changed, right? So that's going to change how it's going to look when we come back to the office, right? We've got the impacts of this financially and otherwise at home, and we need to consider those kinds of human impacts as we return to work. So again, emerging risks and emerging human factor risks, really. The challenge of continued furloughs and organizations downsizing and making staff reductions. That impacts our ability to do audit execution and have segregation of duties and controls, but it also increases human factor risk for things like data exfiltration, right? As people may continue to get laid off, then you have a higher rate of potential data exfiltration as people depart organizations. So really understanding how that looks in a remote environment is a lot different. We may have had things that we could do physically in the past, but those things are no longer, not always going to be in play. So taking into account all of this really sets the stage for what we have to look at as we go forward. So as you know, we've had an unprecedented shift to remote work. This graph here is really a user dispersion graph, and this comes from metadata that Netskope, our threat labs team, identifies, where we were looking at different kinds of patterns in data that we're protecting and this is anonymized data from metadata from customer activities, and basically this shows that most of the time we probably have about 26% of our customers are working remotely, right, at any given time. But as the pandemic was declared and we moved into a much more remote work environment, we've been trending above 60% and even in many cases above 70% for some time. And you'll see different spikes in holidays too in this data, because that's when most people are either away from the office or not working. And this has really highlighted a lot of things for us. And one of the interesting things is around just how we're actually interacting now that we are remote, right? So what this shows is with that same increase and that same pandemic declaration from that initial graph of dispersed users, now we're seeing a difference in how users are interacting with the devices that they're using to do work. Right, so this is the percent of increase on different types of activities that users are doing from their work devices. Normally do at home, and everybody's just doing it on a work device, right? Maybe even a BYOD device, but this is an increase, right? And with this increase comes increases in other areas that we'll touch on here briefly. And this is really the focus of this, right? So we've seen a change in risky user behavior, right? So a major increase in the use of personal devices, right? Personal use of managed devices. So that's up considerably. But really what the big factor is we've seen a major increase in the use of risky applications, right? So up 161%. So this is users, they're doing their work, throughout the day, but they're also interacting and doing things that otherwise that probably wouldn't be acceptable within the office place. So we have to really understand, what risk does that add to our data and how we're interacting with our customers if those employees are in fact interacting with customers. And then what does that ultimately mean from a risk perspective for our organization, right? Are there considerations that we have to make now as we look at, game forward? And I think the answer to that is yes. And we'll highlight a little bit of that here in this next section where we're going to talk about context, visibility, and control. And these really are three elements that are brought together to help define and redefine your control space, right? So when we talk about the controls that you have today, they were limited in their ability to address the remote worker in many cases, right? So what we're really trying to do is reestablish the visibility and understand the context of what a user is doing, where they're doing it, how they're doing it, and what information they might be interacting with. And that allows us to make better risk-based decisions. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about one of the reasons why this is important. First, what we're going to walk through here is just a brief graphic that shows what we call cross-cloud application data movement. And what we call this really is a boundary crossing, meaning that, today, if I have a user that's either working in an office or remotely, essentially see with traditional technologies what that user's doing. Imagine we have an HR employee that's working in an office and they're going to move something to cloud storage, right? And that shows this first movement here on the left. And we're going to have a firewall or proxy there probably, right, in our traditional environment. And we're going to be able to see that initial movement. Now, we might not have full visibility into what happened, but we're going to see that some data moved from this user's machine up to this cloud storage service, right? And so we'll have some insight into that. Maybe we can do some additional inspection and get, more details around it. What the challenge becomes is now that that data has left the barn, right? The data is actually in a cloud service. How do we then inspect all of the other movements or boundary crossings that ultimately can occur? And the challenge becomes, well, we no longer have that man in the middle position. We no longer have an inspection point, right? Because the data is already in the cloud. So we don't have an inspection point in any of these other places, right? So how do we actually so that we can understand that once that initial data movement is actually taken place into that cloud storage platform that we saw, how do we start to grasp what all of those other activities are? And we're going to talk about that today. And there are technologies out there that allow you to do that. The challenge and really the highlight here is if you look at the right side of the screen, this is data that comes from our research and research of other cloud security companies and cloud security studies. When we talk about 35% of cross-app data movement is sensitive, right? So if we're taking 35% of the movement that's going to occur between, in this case, a cloud storage app or a webmail app or a collaboration platform, that 35% of that data is sensitive. And if we think we have about 2,500 different applications or services involved in a typical enterprise, and this is from from our research and from Thales and other research organizations, that starts to highlight for you that your data is really going to a lot of places, right? So keeping in mind that data flows like water, it's always going to find the cracks to get out. That if you've got 50% of your enterprise data now being transacted or interacted or collaborated on in the cloud, and 35% is sensitive, that's moving between these services, we really need to reestablish how to gain insight into these kinds of activities. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of context and what a company like Netskope can provide in terms of giving you the ability to look at different vectors of risk. And so we do this in a variety of ways, and I'm going to walk you through a couple of use cases here to highlight this, but this one in particular is important because we're going to highlight the contextual elements that we can bring together to allow you to make better risk-based decisions, right? So we're going to bring together information about a user, and in this case, we're going to say, well, this is Alice, and she works in an accounting department, and we do know this information. We're going to also bring together some information about the device risk potentially, right? Do we know what kind of device that Alice is on? Is it a managed or a personal device? So now we've got two vectors. We've got what the user, some context about the user, the context about the device. Now we're going to get some context about the application, right? So in this case, she's using Office 365. Now we need to go a little deeper on the application because the application itself has got a lot of different factors that come into play when determining the full context of it. So now that we know it's Office 365, we have to determine then, is this Alice's personal Office 365 or is this something that the company has provided for her to use. And in this case, it's a company application, right? So that gives us another piece of context. And then we're going to look at the application risk. And so Netskope provides coverage for about 39,000 different SaaS applications. And we also provide really what we call application risk scoring. So in this case, we're looking at Office 365, and we're going to look at 50 different attributes for Office 365 as a service. We're going to look at privacy policies, security policies, legal and audit documentation. Are they SOC 1, SOC 2 type attestations in place, all of the things that you would look at in your supplier governance program as a practitioner. We're doing some of those things for you. So it's a starting place for you to understand and get a score. In this case, Microsoft scores very highly, a 97 out of 100, but we're going to provide these kinds of scores to give you a vector of application risk when you're making a decision. We're going to do the same thing when we're looking at URL categories for web browsing, right? So in this case, we understand that Office 365 is a file sharing or collaboration category. So we're going to have that context too. And we're also going to be able to pull apart and understand what the activity that the user can undertake, right? So that in a traditional sense, you might see in a firewall or a proxy log, something like a get or a put of information, and you'll see some bytes up and bytes down of data, data going or data coming down from a service. But what we're actually able to do is pull apart all of the actual JSON that's within the packet that goes to the cloud, and we're going to tell you what that activity is, because that JSON is an instruction to the cloud to inform that service what it's actually supposed to be doing. And so in this case, the user is doing a file upload. So that's a human activity in a cloud service. So now we understand the context of the app, we understand the user, we know the device, we know the instance and the risk factor of the app. Now we need to take a look at the threat context, right? So this is, we know the user's uploading some data, and the last thing we'd want to do is to have that user upload some malware or some other data that really isn't relevant to this cloud service from a threat perspective, right? And so we're going to actually get in and we're going to take a look at this piece of content that's being moved, in this case, a file upload to the Office 365 platform. And lastly, we're going to apply our DLP profiles and rules, right? So we're really going to take a look at this content also from a data protection perspective, right? Is this data that is, sanctioned to go into this service, right? Is it sensitive, but is it allowed in this service, right? Those are all kinds of policy decisions that you can make. But ultimately, what we want to do is it falls within the boundaries of what is acceptable. And if it does, and if all of these things pass, then we can make an actual policy action at the very end of this. And in this case, because Alice was on a managed computer using a corporate Office 365 environment, and she was uploading a file that did not have data that was either infected with a threat or had some other contextual problem, meaning it doesn't belong there, she's going to be allowed to do that activity, right? And this is the kind of power of really starting to look at context-based security controls for enabling you to, put controls around things in a much more frictionless fashion, to enable your business to move faster, but also to address these risk profiles and these risk landscapes that have changed since we're moving many things outside of the traditional perimeter. So let's look at this again in a couple more use cases, because these are all very relevant, right? So in this use case, this is again taking a similar similar point of view, and this we have a guy from finance, and they're remote, and they're on maybe a county supported laptop, and they're going to upload a financial record to a corporate storage application. Right? In this case, we're going to use all of those contextual elements, and we're going to either allow or deny, this activity based on if it's a high risk or unauthorized cloud service. So we're going to take a look at all of those same things: the user, where they're located, are they on a device that we understand? What's the content? Is it got a threat? Does it have some sensitive data that we're not going to allow? And in this case, you're making a decision at the end to either coach the user and give them an alternative, or to outright block them from doing this action. If we take this a step further, we take a look at something that might be a little different, right? So this is a BYOD device, right? So we have an HR person at home, and they're on a personal tablet, right? And they want to download a document from Workday, something that's an employee document. And in this case, because this is an unmanaged device, we're going to say you can't download it, but we're going to allow this is a personal device, and that sensitive information that could be in an HR platform doesn't really belong on that personal device. We're going to let them read the document, right? They can get some information from the document, but we're not going to actually let them bring the entire piece of content down to their device, right? Again, allowing granular controls to solve control problems and access problems for services. Again, we're going to take a look at, accidental exposure again. In this case, we have another finance employee that's remote. This time they're on a managed device, and they're trying to send a document to Teams, right? It's a budget document. And in this case, if this user is interacting with internal staff members in a corporate version of Teams that we're probably all using very often today, we're going to allow that interaction around that budget document. But if this user is trying to share this document that's a budgetary document with an external entity, right, someone else's Teams instance or another corporate instance that might not be relevant for this type of information, we're going to coach them or block them from doing this activity. But otherwise, if they meet the requirements, they're going to be able to do the transaction. And lastly, really looking at this from a risk perspective, right? So in this case, we have a gentleman from engineering. They're at home on their work laptop, and they're trying to upload a competitive bid into a collaboration service, right? So now we're looking at the services based upon risk only, right? We're really just saying this isn't, hypersensitive information. We're just trying to collaborate around this information, and if it's going to a low risk cloud service, we may allow this to actually occur. But if this user were to have chosen something that was a high-risk cloud service, then we wouldn't allow them to actually move that data over there. So really just looking at this use case from the perspective of what is the application risk? And again, going back to that context that we talked about earlier. So let's talk about how to reestablish this visibility. And I really want to jump into kind of the nuts and bolts of really kind of understanding how architectures have shifted to take advantage of the things that we just talked about, right? So this is kind of a mind shift in technology, and it's really a convergence, and we're going to talk about it as an inversion. So what we talk about is really kind of turning what our traditional model is inside out, but we're going to talk about it really truly as a convergence of two things: security as a service and networking as a service being brought together to offer you a new way to get your traffic to where it ultimately is trying to go. But also to bring about the right security controls so that no matter where your users are working, you're able to adapt your controls to what the users ultimately are trying to do, regardless of what the service provider that they're trying to use. And so we'll talk a little bit about history here, but we'll also talk about where things are going and really sort of the future. So one of the things that we often talk about, and I often advise our prospects and customers on, is really there's a journey in front of us, right? And in many cases, you can't look at this journey as just this linear shift from the left to the right. Right? In many cases, we're always within our organizations, whether you're in the private or public sector, you're going to be in one or more of these places, right? So we're probably always going to have some data centers, right? That doesn't mean that we're not going to move things out of those data centers. There's probably just always going to be things that are going to have to live in a data center. But at the same time, we're also going to be adopting, different types of new technology like cloud services. And so that puts our view of the world into two or more of these boxes, right, in terms of how we're operating. And the challenge really becomes, how do you address security if you're still in the data center, but you also are moving into the cloud? You really need to have kind of two world views, and it really kind of needs to be brought together in one way for you to be able to see that. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today and really the importance of this. So let's talk about where we've come from first. So when we talk about yesterday, this should seem pretty straightforward, and I'm sure most have really looked at this. And we really looked at things with some basic table stakes, right? So we wanted to keep the good stuff inside the data center. We wanted to keep the bad stuff out. We relied a lot on URL and content filtering to do that. Our networks are probably made up of kind of hub and spoke MPLS clouds, where you've got data centers connected to branch offices that were brought together by an MPLS network. And in this kind of a network, there is a perimeter. There is a defined sort of perimeter here. And with that comes something that we call an assumed trust, right? You're on the network. We have to establish some level of trust to get you onto the network. But once you're on that network, for the most part, you're provisioned, and there's an assumed trust that you and that device that you've brought onto that network is trustworthy, right? And so these kinds of things have changed, as we all know. And so when we look at this in an architecture, this is called a site-centric model. And so really what this means is we put the data center as the center of our universe, and then all of those services are kind of, whether they're networking or whether they're security, right? They may all be entombed inside boxes in that data center, but we have distinct stacks of technology that are providing these services. So whether you're going to a branch office, whether a user is coming in remotely, these services have to be brought together to try and drive better outcomes and offer the controls that we ultimately to need as part of our security programs. The challenge with this is we know that the perimeter has since dissolved, right? And so when we look at today, it's much more complicated, right? There's no trust on there shouldn't be trust on the inside of the network, just as there isn't on the outside of the network. Kind of looking at things from a zero trust principle architectural point of view, right? So there's challenges here. The focus today obviously is a little different, right? We're focusing on transforming. We're trying to change our environment to address new business cases and scaling and performance and flexibility and being able to move security to where ultimately the data is going. Right? There's a consumer point of view today that users want instantaneous access like they do in their personal lives, right? So they need to have their work and their corporate applications, enterprise applications delivered them into a very expeditious manner, and they have to be done so in a way that provides them access to it, low friction, right? So the expectations are changing too. Our hub and spoke model has changed as well, right? So no longer are we really tethered as much to these branch offices with MPLS cloud, where we've taken on things like SD-WAN networking capabilities, and we're doing things a little bit differently. And now the goals are really to stop that external and insider threat, right? Ensuring that we understand that there's less trust than there used to be. And really then now the goal is to protect the data regardless of the location, right? So it doesn't matter if it's in the data center, it doesn't matter if it's in the cloud. We need to have security controls that can adopt and adapt to this changing paradigm. When we talk about this as a service, this inversion or convergence that we're talking about here really is something called the Secure Access Service Edge. So this is a new technology kind of convergence, right, where we're bringing together network as a service and security as a service into an architectural model that is called SASE, right? So this is not one single product, it's an ecosystem. But what this provides the opportunity for practitioners and auditors and risk management professionals alike is to really redefine how you look at your network and how you look at your security stack as it relates to that, right? Moving security to the edge is really the key here. And this is really the way to adopt and to adapt in a digitally transformed environment, meaning that as your business takes on new opportunities in digital, you need to find ways to adapt your security controls to be able to manage that, right? So there's an expectation that we'll be able to help to enable the business actually to move faster if we can bring to bear some of these capabilities. And so when we think about this in the use cases that we just talked about, this is the way that it ultimately all comes together. So the key here becomes when we have these types of controls and this type of an architecture, it doesn't really matter what the use case is, right? So in this use case, we have a remote user on our corporate laptop trying to get to Salesforce, like we just walked through, right? And in this SASE architecture, the network as a service and a security as a service function together, right? These are software-defined services, right? So now what we've done is we've ultimately taken those boxes that used to be in our data center and we've abstracted that technology and made it into software. And now we've connected different providers together to be able to provide these services to our businesses to enable these use cases, right? So you can imagine the various permutations that use cases that ultimately are brought together here. So in this case, the network as a service, services that light up, or quality of service and specific routing and SaaS acceleration, because we know that Salesforce is a SaaS platform, right? So this is smart networking. They're going to get us as quickly as possible to the Salesforce application. And we're also going to light up a bunch of security services, right? We're going to have cloud access security broker capabilities, data protection capabilities, secure web gateway capabilities, and some zero trust access to enable Pat to successfully and safely get from his device, from her device up to Salesforce to interact with the Salesforce cloud, right? So it doesn't really matter what the user is trying to interact with, right? It could be getting back to a data center. And in that case, we will have a zero trust network access facility that replaces a VPN that will enable that user to safely get back to the service or the protocol that they're trying to interact with in the data center. So again, a unified approach to delivering network in one way. And that's how you can really bring that visibility and rethink sort of how you've traditionally done things in the data center to address these new use cases and really the new way of working for the remote employee. So when we talk about the benefits of this type of an architecture, it's really about addressing a tremendous amount of use cases, right? So when we think about this the HQ data center model, and we talked about sort of abstracting all of these boxes that we used to have, that's really what we've done. We've pulled all of this technology out and we've built it into software, and now we're connecting it with other providers to give you that ease of use and reduce operational overhead. And really, the importance here is about bringing about more effective controls, right? So you're improving security because now you're securing access back to the data center in a way where you're implementing zero trust principles, but you're also following your data to where it's going, right? So if the user is going to the internet, you're getting a visibility into that. If they're on a you're getting visibility into that. You're getting visibility into the branch traffic, right? So really, it doesn't matter where you're working. The key is bringing all of this together and bringing capabilities together, like Cloud Access Security Broker, like Firewall as a Service and data protection, and the Secure Web Gateway, really bringing that together and as a unified product and enabling that product to expand over time so that we're able to connect with other SD-WAN providers and networking providers and ultimately deliver the traditional services that you had in your data center in a much more abstracted way, much closer to where your data is going. Right? This reduces operational overhead and really brings about more transparency and visibility so that you can have the controls that you need to address the remote work change and shift. So when you think about it, that data center now, if we're able to protect from the cloud, that data center now is really, consolidating and reducing the footprint of the technology that's there, kind of getting down to, protect the contents in that data center because you've now abstracted and moved these things outside and are able to apply them to various use cases through this SASE model. So when we take a look at this from an architecture perspective, if we simplify it using our original graph, the inversion is really that we've taken the data center out of the center of our universe and we put the user there, right? So now it doesn't matter what the user is trying to do. We need to be able to initiate or light up services that are necessary to secure and to effectively get the traffic to where it needs to go. So if that user is going to the internet, we're going to do that. If they're going to infrastructure as a service, to access those environments, we have to be able to light up the services relevant to that. If they're going to SaaS services, we need to be able to light up the Cloud Access Security Broker services and other services to enable safe use of those services and to ensure the data stays where it's supposed to. And if you're trying to get back into your headquarters or your data, right? So each of these things that are really encircling this user in the middle of our universe are the services that we want to be able to light up, and that will give us the ability to have the controls to get us to where we ultimately need to go. And so when we think about this in the context of really the future, you have to think about what the future security stack ultimately is going to look like, right? And if you were able to kind of break this down and simplify everything, there are really like 4 primary things that you need. And this isn't to say that you're not going to have many other tools, but when you think about consolidation, if you're able to bring about strong endpoint device management, right, that enables you to exchange threat intelligence with kind of a centralized hub or brain for your operation, right? In this case, our secure access service edge. And you're able to marry that with a strong identity program, from privilege to SSO to multi-factor authentication, and you're able to access service edge. Now you've got your identity context that we talked about that was being so important, and you've got your device context, right? So now we understand the devices that users are interacting from, we understand the identities, and we have the mechanisms by which to authenticate them and authorize them and to do different things based upon the context of what the user's doing. And if you then bring together automation and orchestration, we can really start to bring better value from this type of a platform, right? So this ecosystem of technologies being brought together can really simplify your environment and can ultimately bring to you the context to be able to make those risk-based decisions. And that secure access service edge, that marriage of sort of those security services and networking services, ultimately becomes sort of the motherboard or the brain of the operation and brings together all of these other technologies to get a better outcome, right? It's sort of the traffic cop that's going to determine from a policy perspective, on the context that's being driven from the identity space, from the endpoint space, and through some of the orchestration and other capabilities that we have. And that decision making then allows us to address the use cases of the application services stack, right? So when we talk about that, we're talking about any user from anywhere, right? Interacting with the web as they would today, interacting with SaaS or software as a service, interacting with infrastructure or platform as a service, or going back to their data center, right? We're really trying to address the entire sort of ecosystem with a very simplified model. And again, like I said, you will have other technologies ultimately, right? We're not talking about application security here and other things like that. But really what this is allowing you to do is to think about consolidation and think about, you know, less lifecycle management long term. And as you start to migrate to a platform that takes into account these kinds of principles, it allows you to address risk in a much different way, right? You're going to have from all of the interactions that users are going to have. You're going to develop patterns and history for what users are going to be doing. So then you get a better risk insight or better risk scoring on your users. You're going to have patterns and history over the applications that users use, right? So your SaaS applications, you're going to have that inventory of those SaaS applications. You're going to have that risk scoring that we talked about, right? Determining which ones are risky and which ones aren't. That can drive procurement activities and all kinds of other things, right? You could decide, if we have all risky collaboration platforms right now, maybe we need to find some that aren't, right? So thus reducing that risk. And really bringing that all together around identity and really understanding the data and the context of the data that's being interacted allows for much smarter security controls, right? And the point here is really to reduce friction and to unify the view that we have of this type of an environment so that our operators, our operations areas can be really repurposed to do more important things instead of chasing data from 35 different systems to do an investigation. You're actually going to have all of this data in a very relevant context, in a place that brings it all together so that you're able to make better decisions, right? So from an incident response and a response activity perspective, really simplifying sort of that view so that you're not going and fishing across all sorts of different platforms to try and find those, you know, the relevant telemetry to provide the better outcome. And so as we look at this model and we go forward, this is really where you know, the future is going. We're seeing a lot about this. You're going to hear a lot about it. There's a lot of companies out there that are going to talk about it as if it's a product, and it's not. It's really an ecosystem. You have to kind of think of it very similarly to how we've looked at zero trust. Again, zero trust is not a product. The concepts have been marketized and so on, and we certainly have a lot of architecture about it. But these concepts are really bringing together an ecosystem of things that to drive, and zero trust is a big part of this. But the Secure Access Service Edge really becomes that delivery mechanism where you're able to bring together all of this data to have a better risk-based decision. And with that, I'd like to address any questions that you might have. Thank you very much for your time today. I've enjoyed the presentation, and hopefully you guys have as well, and hopefully you have some great questions.
Thanks very much, Nate. We don't see any questions here. So if anybody has a last-minute question, please enter it into the Q&A section, and we'll have Nate address your question. Okay. Okay, we'll end this session at this point. And Nate, thank you very much for your interesting presentation and the time you spent with us.
Thank you very much.
Session,
thank you.
Yep. Breakout session number 2 is at 11:10.